It began with a whisper of orders, carried across the humid air of 1944. Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda stood on the deck of a small transport vessel bound for the Philippines, clutching his rifle like an extension of his soul. Around him, the sea was dark and heavy, rolling under a sullen sky. He was 22, young enough to believe that duty could outlast fear, that a man could serve forever if honor demanded it. He had been trained in Futamata, a military intelligence school that specialized in unconventional warfare, sabotage, espionage, endurance. His instructors told him that surrender was not an option. If Japan fell, her soldiers must not. A true warrior never lays down his arms. When the ship reached Lubang Island, a small, forested dot west of Manila, Onoda stepped ashore and saluted the trees. They towered like ancient sentinels, the air thick with the scent of rain and decay. His orders were clear: resist the enemy, destroy airstrips and piers, gather intelligence, and never, under any circumstance, take his own life. It sounded simple when written in ink. But the island had other plans. The war moved faster than men could comprehend. Within months the tide had turned. Allied forces advanced, villages burned, radio contact fractured into silence. The Japanese garrison was scattered, some killed, some captured, some hiding like ghosts in the forest. Onoda and 3 others slipped into the green labyrinth of the jungle, believing they were carrying on Japan's last breath of defiance. They were armed with rifles, grenades, a ceremonial sword, and belief that Japan would one day return. The jungle became their fortress and their prison. Days bled into nights of monsoon rain and fevered dreams. The men built shelters of bamboo and palm leaves, watched the coast from the shadows, and rationed their rice with the precision of monks. When Allied planes passed overhead, they hid beneath the thick canopy, whispering prayers into the mud. When leaflets dropped from the sky, messages declaring that the war had ended, they dismissed them as enemy tricks. The language was too polished, the paper too clean. The war could not end in surrender. It was unthinkable. They held fast to that belief as years began to turn like slow-moving seasons. The jungle grew around them, vines twisting over their shelters, roots pushing through the earth like veins. They learned to move silently through the undergrowth, to trap fish in streams, to recognize the glint of metal that might mean an enemy's rifle. Every distant sound became a signal, every footprint a story. At night, Onoda lay awake, listening to the jungle's breathing, the sigh of wind through trees, the croak of frogs, the hum of insects that never seemed to rest. He imagined the war still raging across the Pacific, ships burning, planes falling, orders being whispered in languages he no longer heard. He waited for Japan's return, for the signal that would end their vigil. But no signal came. Only rain, only silence, only the slow, stubborn rhythm of survival. By 1949, 5 years had passed. One of his men, Private Akatsu, could no longer bear it. He surrendered to the Philippine authorities, leaving behind his rifle and his comrades' trust. Onoda, furious and unyielding, called him a traitor. The jungle had become sacred ground. To abandon it was to betray the emperor himself. 3 remained now: Onoda, Corporal Shimada, and Private Kozuka. They tightened their patrols, sharpened their knives, and reinforced their belief that Japan still needed them. Every distant explosion, a farmer burning brush, a storm cracking a tree, they took as proof the war was ongoing. The island became smaller as years slipped by. Familiar trails turned to tunnels of memory. Sometimes they found old uniforms rotting in the mud, remnants of comrades lost to disease or time. Other times, they came across Filipino villagers, mistaking them for guerrillas. Shots would echo through the forest, brief and terrible, followed by silence. Each night, Onoda wrote in a small notebook, his handwriting neat and disciplined even as his world shrank to green and shadow. "Our mission continues," he wrote. "We will hold out until the Imperial Army returns. Japan does not surrender." But Japan had surrendered, nearly 3 decades ago. And so the island that time forgot became home to a soldier who could not wake from the war. The world had moved on, empires fallen, cities rebuilt, men turned to dust, yet Onoda remained, pacing beneath the same trees, keeping the same watch. The jungle, indifferent and eternal, held him close. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a ghost of duty itself. Years became decades. The island changed with every storm, but the man who refused to yield did not. To him, time was still 1944, and Japan was still waiting. Rain fell, trees grew, rivers shifted course. The jungle had swallowed what little evidence there had once been of armies and airfields. But Onoda's small band of soldiers remained vigilant. They patrolled the ridges at dawn, keeping to the shadows. They maintained their rifles, cleaned the bolts with oil squeezed from coconuts, and folded their uniforms neatly each night, as though the Emperor himself might appear for inspection. The seasons blurred. Dry months baked the ground to dust, wet ones drowned the valleys in green floods. Sometimes the men heard faint sounds from the coast, the roar of engines, the buzz of aircraft, the laughter of villagers. But to them, every sound was suspicion. Every stranger was the enemy. In 1950, they saw lights flickering in the distance, the glow of electric lamps newly installed in the small towns of post-war Philippines. To Onoda, it was evidence of occupation. "The enemy has built bases," he whispered to Kozuka. "They are preparing for another offensive." And so they hid deeper in the forest. They built shelters that melted into the foliage, walls of bamboo, roofs thatched with palm leaves, camouflaged traps near the trails. The jungle was their fortress, and they had become its ghosts. Food came from what the land offered: wild bananas, coconuts, roots, and stolen cattle. Onoda kept careful records of each hunt, every encounter. He still believed that someday, headquarters in Tokyo would commend his persistence. He would present his reports, bow deeply, and say, "Mission accomplished." But Tokyo no longer remembered his mission. The war had ended in surrender, reconstruction, and the hum of a new kind of peace. The empire was gone, replaced by neon lights and concrete. Children now played baseball where once soldiers trained with bayonets. Yet on Lubang Island, under the dense canopy, time stood still. In 1954, tragedy came quietly. Corporal Shimada was shot by a search party. He died clutching his rifle, murmuring apologies for failing the emperor. Onoda buried him with full military honors. He cleaned his weapon, saluted, and swore the mission would continue. Only 2 remained now, Onoda and Kozuka. The years rolled forward like the slow breath of the sea. Each passing storm stripped another layer of youth from their faces, leaving behind the hollow calm of men who had forgotten what laughter was. In 1959, a new kind of noise came: radios, music, the hum of fishing boats. The island's villages had modernized. Tourists sometimes visited the beaches. Onoda watched them from afar through his field glasses, puzzled by the colors of their clothes, the easy way they moved. He believed they were enemy agents, perhaps Americans, perhaps Filipino collaborators. He and Kozuka stayed hidden, sometimes stealing food or tools but never approaching openly. Now and then, planes still passed overhead, their wings flashing in the sunlight. Leaflets drifted down again, printed in brighter ink, carrying photographs of families, messages of peace. One bearing the date 1957 declared, "Japan has surrendered. Soldiers, you may come home." Kozuka read it aloud, his hands trembling. Could it be true? Onoda shook his head. "The enemy has improved their forgeries. They want us to surrender dishonorably. Never forget your orders." It was no longer defiance, it was faith. And faith, when tested too long, can become a kind of blindness. So they remained. The forest grew quieter over time. The birds they once hunted became rarer,
replaced by new species drawn from nearby islands. Rivers dried, then returned. Insects chewed through what remained of their uniforms until they wore patches of cloth and bark. Still, Onoda cleaned his rifle every morning. Still, he greeted the dawn with a soldier's salute. In his mind, Japan still stood proud. The emperor still waited. The war still raged. But the truth, that the world had moved on without him, was something the jungle kept secret. By 1960, Onoda had been fighting a war that existed only in his imagination for 16 years. Yet even that knowledge, had it reached him, might not have broken the spell. His life had narrowed to a single mission, and in the stillness of the forest, that mission was all that gave meaning to his breath. In a way, he had become what the war had always wanted, an unyielding spirit, impervious to time, immune to doubt. The trees whispered, and he listened. The rain fell, and he took it as an omen. Every sunrise was another chance to serve. He did not realize that the rest of the world had already forgiven him, because no one had remembered him long enough to hold a grudge. By the 1960s, he was more legend than man, a rumor among villagers, a ghost whispered about by fishermen. They said a soldier still haunted the jungle, carrying a rifle from a war long gone. Some swore they'd seen him at dusk, standing among the ferns, his eyes bright as lanterns. Others heard the echo of his boots in the night, steady and deliberate, as if time itself marched beside him. Children were warned not to wander too deep into the woods. "The Japanese ghost will take you," their elders whispered. "He thinks the war still goes on." But Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda was no ghost, not yet. He was alive, alert, and more disciplined than ever. The forest had molded itself around his presence. Even the animals seemed to avoid his paths. His camouflage was perfect, his instincts sharpened by 20 years of vigilance. He and Kozuka still performed drills, though the rhythm of their movements had slowed. They practiced maneuvers at dawn, with rifles that gleamed like relics. Afterward, they'd sit by the fire, sharing bits of roasted yam, talking about Japan as if it were still a nation at war. Kozuka sometimes spoke of home. "What if our families think we are dead?" he would ask quietly. Onoda would answer with unwavering conviction. "Then we must live so long that one day, they will know we endured. The Emperor's soldiers never die in vain." It wasn't madness, exactly. It was loyalty fermented over decades, distilled until it became something unbreakable.
And yet cracks began to form. The jungle's silence had grown heavy. The sound of axes echoed closer each year, new settlers clearing land, expanding villages. They brought transistor radios, whose music drifted through the trees. Onoda would crouch, listening to the strange rhythms, to voices that spoke in a Japanese far different from his own. He could barely understand the slang, the softness of a generation that had never held a rifle. He called it enemy propaganda. In truth, it was the laughter of a world that had moved on. One night, in 1964, Kozuka found an old newspaper in a villager's hut they raided for rice. The headline showed something impossible: the Tokyo Olympics. Japanese athletes waving the rising sun in triumph, cheered by crowds of nations once considered enemies. Kozuka stared at it for hours. "Lieutenant," he said, voice trembling. "Look, Japan hosts the world. Could the war truly be over?" Onoda took the paper and studied it by firelight. He saw the bright faces, the banners, the peace. It made his stomach twist. "They are using Japan's name," he said finally, voice low. "The enemy has become clever. They want to break our spirit." And with that, he threw the newspaper into the fire. The flames devoured it, and the night went on as it always had. But something in Kozuka changed after that. His steps grew slower, his silences longer. Sometimes, Onoda caught him gazing toward the sea, as though wondering what lay beyond the endless horizon. By 1970, the jungle no longer frightened the villagers. Young men went hunting for the Japanese ghost, just to boast. Soldiers were sent occasionally, hoping to make contact, but Onoda always slipped away. The forest was his ally. Until one night in 1972, when it turned against him.
He and Kozuka had come down from the hills to burn a farmer's rice store, an act of defiance, meant to remind the enemy that Japan had not surrendered. But the villagers were ready this time. Shots rang out, the air cracked with gunfire, and Kozuka fell before Onoda's eyes. He crawled through the grass, clutching his friend's lifeless hand, whispering, "Stand up, soldier! The war is not over!" But Kozuka did not move. When dawn came, Onoda buried him beside a stream and saluted, his arms shaking. "You did not fail," he said softly. "You stayed true." Then he vanished back into the green. Now he was utterly alone. For 2 more years, the island was his entire world. He slept in the same shelters, tended the same rifle, spoke to the same ghosts. Until, one day in 1974, a stranger with a smile found him where no one else could. The man's name was Norio Suzuki, a Japanese adventurer, a young wanderer chasing stories instead of orders. He had told his friends back home that he was setting out to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. The first of those quests led him to Lubang Island. While others had searched with leaflets, radios, or military patrols, Suzuki brought only curiosity and a camera. He wandered the island for days, sleeping under the same stars that had once guided Onoda's watch. Then, deep in the jungle, beside a river choked with vines, he saw movement, a flicker of khaki and the gleam of steel. Onoda stepped out, rifle raised. His uniform was threadbare but still immaculate, his face shadowed by years of solitude. He looked every inch the officer he had been 3 decades before. Suzuki froze, not in fear but in awe. "Lieutenant Onoda?" he called softly in Japanese. "I'm from your country. The war, it ended long ago." Onoda's eyes narrowed. "You lie," he said. His voice was steady, disciplined, untouched by time. "Who sent you?" Suzuki smiled, a simple, open smile that disarmed even the jungle's silence. "No one sent me. I came because I wanted to meet you." It was the first time in 29 years that anyone had spoken to Onoda without hostility. The lieutenant motioned for him to sit. The 2 men talked for hours, beneath the rustle of palm leaves. Suzuki told him of Japan, of cities rebuilt from ashes, of trains that flew faster than birds, of color televisions and neon streets. He spoke of peace, of how Japan now sold radios and cameras instead of rifles. Onoda listened but remained cautious. "You could have learned these things from any captured document," he said. "Prove it." "I can't," Suzuki admitted. "But if you tell me what proof you need, I'll bring it." That touched something deep in Onoda, a soldier's respect for precision. He told Suzuki that he would only surrender his command to a superior officer, in person, and only with direct orders from headquarters. Suzuki nodded. "Then I'll bring him." They parted as dusk fell. Onoda watched him leave, uncertain if he would ever see the man again. The jungle seemed quieter that night. The insects hummed their endless hymn, and Onoda sat by the river, staring into his reflection, a stranger with sunken eyes and the stubborn dignity of another century. He whispered to the water, "If the war truly ended, then what have I been fighting?" For the first time, the question echoed back at him with no answer. Weeks later, the sound of voices returned, this time, familiar ones. Suzuki had made good on his word. He had found Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now an old man working in a bookstore in Tokyo. Together they crossed the sea and stepped onto the soil of Lubang Island. On March 9, 1974, 30 years after his orders had first been issued, Onoda stood in full uniform as Taniguchi approached through the trees. The major's hair was white now, but his voice carried the same authority.
He unfolded a document and read aloud. "Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, all combat operations are to cease. The war has ended. You are to lay down your arms and return home." For a long moment, Onoda didn't move. The forest held its breath. Then, slowly, he lowered his rifle. He removed his sword and handed it to his superior, eyes glistening not with defeat, but with release. "Sir," he said, voice trembling, "I am sorry it took me so long." Taniguchi nodded. "You did your duty. Welcome home." And with that, the longest war a man had ever fought came to an end. When Onoda finally stepped out of the jungle, the world greeted him like a ghost made flesh. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted his name. But he moved as if half asleep, as though waking from a dream that the world no longer remembered. The heat of the cameras stung his eyes. The crowds blurred together into a single wall of noise. Men in bright shirts pressed close, waving microphones. Women held flowers. And above them all, banners fluttered with words he could hardly believe. "Welcome home, Lieutenant Onoda." It felt like stepping from one century into another. For 30 years he had lived by the rhythm of rain and sunrise. Now he stood in a world of engines and electricity, of asphalt roads and color film. He blinked at the sight of cars gliding past, their surfaces shining like mirrors. Radios buzzed with cheerful music. There were no soldiers, no curfews, no gunfire, only peace, humming through the air like a song he did not know. He bowed deeply before the Philippine president, Ferdinand Marcos, who granted him a full pardon for the skirmishes that had claimed local lives. Onoda's voice, when he finally spoke to the press, was formal and restrained. "I apologize for any harm I caused. Everything I did for my country." There was no defiance in his tone, only the quiet dignity of a man who had fulfilled an impossible duty. Then came Japan. When the plane touched down in Tokyo, he stepped onto home soil for the first time since 1944. He stood still, breathing in the air as though trying to recognize its scent. Reporters crowded close, calling his name. The flashbulbs burst again, white ghosts of light that made him flinch. The city was unrecognizable. Skyscrapers rose where firebombs had once fallen. Neon signs glowed in pink and blue. People walked in suits and dresses, smiling freely, speaking words he barely understood. The language had changed, softened by peace. At a welcome ceremony, he was presented to the public, a living relic of a war most wished to forget. Children stared up at him, whispering to their parents. Some bowed respectfully, others giggled at the sight of his old uniform, the saber at his side. He looked out over the crowd and saw not comrades or enemies, but strangers. The Japan he had fought for no longer existed. That night, in a quiet hotel room overlooking the glittering streets of Tokyo, Onoda sat by the window in silence. The hum of the city was constant, a far cry from the whispers of the jungle. He removed his cap, set it on the table, and traced the faded insignia with one finger. What did it mean to survive a war that no longer remembered you? He had followed his orders perfectly. He had endured hunger, isolation, death. He had stayed true to the Emperor's command. Yet now, his loyalty made him something of a curiosity, a headline, a living museum piece. The papers called him the soldier who wouldn't surrender. The children called him the man from yesterday. And perhaps that was exactly what he was, a man who belonged to a vanished world, carried forward by the stubborn machinery of duty. In the following weeks, he tried to adjust. He walked through department stores filled with wonders, plastic toys, televisions, bright candies wrapped in foil. He watched trains streak through stations like lightning. He met students who spoke freely of politics, of love, of peace, words that would once have been unthinkable. He smiled politely, but his heart remained in the shadows of Lubang Island. He would wake at night, startled by the hum of the refrigerator, thinking it was the drone of a bomber. He'd reach for his rifle before remembering it had been taken away. The bed was too soft, the silence too foreign. Sometimes, he would look out at the Tokyo skyline and wonder if the jungle had been more real than this. Because in the jungle, he had known who he was, a soldier, a servant of his country, a man with orders. Here, he was only a story. And so, even as Japan celebrated him, Hiroo Onoda quietly began to plan his next mission, one not of war, but of meaning. He tried to find a purpose in peace, but peace, he discovered, required a different kind of courage. And so he looked once more toward the forests, not to fight, but to live. In the months after his return, the Japanese government treated him with reverence. He was invited to ceremonies, interviewed on television, honored by veterans' associations. His face appeared in magazines beside captions like, "The Last Samurai of the Pacific." But Onoda felt none of it. To him, Tokyo was louder than any battlefield. People moved too quickly, talked too freely, lived too easily. There was no discipline, no order, only the hum of convenience. Children laughed at the idea of loyalty to an emperor. Young men grew their hair long and spoke of freedom instead of duty. The Japan he saw around him seemed soft, unanchored, drifting. He had given his life to a war that had ended before he even knew it. And now, in the land of peace, he could not find where his loyalty belonged. At night, he often dreamed of Lubang. The whisper of wind through bamboo. The creak of his rifle sling. The crackle of a campfire beneath the stars. He would wake and find himself in a Tokyo apartment, surrounded by chrome, glass, and the endless hum of machines. He longed for silence, for purpose, for something that made sense. So, in 1975, a year after his return, Hiroo Onoda did something few could understand. He left Japan again. He sailed to Brazil, where a community of Japanese immigrants had settled decades earlier. There, among farmers and open skies, he felt something closer to peace. He learned to raise cattle, to mend fences, to till the earth. The rhythms of nature returned, the kind he could trust. But even there, his instincts never left him. He kept his tools sharpened as if they were weapons. He rose before dawn, marched along his land like a sentry. The discipline of a soldier had become the framework of his soul. In Brazil, people admired his dedication. They called him Senor Onoda, the quiet man who worked harder than anyone, who never complained, who bowed to the sunrise. Still, his mind wandered. He wrote letters to friends in Japan, speaking of his doubts. "The world seems to have lost something," he wrote once. "People no longer believe in anything greater than themselves. Perhaps that is what peace costs." Years passed. The war was now a chapter in history books. Students studied it with the same distance they gave to ancient battles. Then, in the early 1980s, Onoda received a letter from a young Japanese boy who had read about his life. The boy wrote, "I wish I had something to fight for, the way you did." Those words stirred something deep in him. For the first time in decades, he realized he could teach what the jungle had taught him: endurance, self-reliance, devotion. And so, he returned once again to Japan, this time not as a soldier, but as a teacher. He founded Onoda Shurzenjuku, a nature survival school for young people. There, in the forests of Nagano Prefecture, he taught children how to live with the land, how to build fires, cross rivers, endure hardship, and think with calm under pressure. He taught them discipline, respect, and the strength to carry out one's duty, even when no one is watching. He told them stories, not of glory, but of perseverance. Of how belief can carry a man through decades of solitude, and how faith, when balanced with reason, can be both burden and salvation. In the quiet evenings, sitting by the fire surrounded by his students, he would sometimes smile faintly and say, "The jungle was cruel, but it was also honest. It never lied to me." And though Japan had changed beyond recognition, the forest still spoke the same language he had always understood. In those moments, perhaps, Lieutenant Onoda, the soldier who couldn't stop fighting, finally found peace, not in surrender, but in survival. But time, as always, moved onward. The man who had refused to surrender to an empire's fall now faced a quieter battle, the slow passing of years, and the weight of memory that even discipline could not silence. By the 1990s, Hiroo Onoda was an old man. His back had bent slightly, but his posture remained soldierly, every gesture deliberate, every movement precise. His students at the survival school watched him with reverence. He could start a fire in rain, track an animal through fog, or read the time from shadows alone. To them, he was more than a teacher. He was living proof that conviction could outlast despair. Yet when night fell, and the camp grew silent, he often sat alone beside the embers, lost in thought. The forest around him whispered as it once had on Lubang Island, but now the whispers came with ghosts. He would remember the faces of his men, Kozuka, Shimada, Akatsu, the comrades who had faded into the jungle long before he had left it. He would recall their laughter, their oaths, their slow transformation into shadows of duty. Sometimes, he spoke their names quietly, as if checking roll call. The students never disturbed him in those moments. They sensed that the silence was sacred, a bridge between two worlds, between a past still breathing in one man's heart, and a present that no longer understood its pulse. In public, Onoda remained gracious and reserved. He gave interviews occasionally, always with humility. When asked if he regretted his long war, he would answer gently, "I did only what I was ordered to do. For me, the war truly ended when my commanding officer told me so. Until then, surrender was not my choice to make. It was not pride. It was clarity." He was not ashamed of what he had done, nor did he glorify it. He simply accepted it as his truth, the shape his life had taken, carved by faith and solitude. He was sometimes asked what had kept him alive through those 30 years. He would pause, think deeply, then say, "Discipline. And the knowledge that if I gave up, the world I believed in would vanish completely." But as he aged, the discipline softened into wisdom. He no longer spoke of enemies, only of endurance. He no longer saw Japan as a nation of shame or victory, but as a place still learning how to live without war. In 1996, he returned briefly to Lubang Island. The villagers, once frightened of the jungle soldier, welcomed him as a friend. They offered him food, laughter, forgiveness. He walked among the trees that had been his home for half a lifetime. The forest had grown wilder, but he recognized its bones, the riverbank where he'd buried Kozuka, the ridge where he'd watched for planes, the bamboo thicket where he'd hidden his rifle. He stood there for a long time, eyes closed, listening to the sound of rain through leaves. And perhaps, in that sound, he finally heard what the jungle had been trying to tell him all along, that wars end, but the memories they leave behind must be lived through slowly, like a second lifetime. When he returned to Japan, he brought back a handful of Lubang soil in a small pouch. He kept it on his desk, beside a framed photograph of his men. "To remind me," he told a student once, "that even the hardest ground can grow something new." Years drifted quietly. The students he trained went on to become explorers, teachers, parents. The world continued to spin faster. Digital screens replaced newspapers. Voices came through wires instead of faces. But Onoda still wrote with a fountain pen, still polished his boots every morning, still bowed to the rising sun. He did not fight time. He simply outlasted it. And when he spoke to young people who asked what he had learned after all those years, he smiled faintly and said, "A man's duty is not to fight forever, but to endure long enough to understand why he fought." The forest around his school would sigh in the wind, and the sound would linger like an unfinished sentence. In his final years, the jungle soldier became a quiet philosopher, a man whose greatest victory was learning how to live without an enemy. Gone were the days of salutes and battle drills. The rifle had been replaced by walking sticks, the bark of command by gentle advice. And yet, even as age softened his voice, his words carried the same discipline that had once kept him alive through monsoon and hunger. He taught not from books, but from memory. From the lessons the forest had carved into his bones. When asked about courage, he said it was not the absence of fear, but the patience to face it every day until it loses its teeth. When asked about loyalty, he said it should never be blind, that devotion without thought turns men into ghosts. And when asked what he missed most about the war, he would close his eyes for a moment and reply, "The certainty. The world was smaller then. You always knew what mattered." At his survival school, the students came to see him less as a war hero and more as a quiet guardian, someone who had walked to the very edge of human conviction and returned with his humanity intact. He moved slowly now, his hair silver, his uniform long since folded away. But his presence still commanded a hush when he entered the clearing. The firelight reflected off his eyes, and the forest seemed to lean closer to listen. He would tell them stories, not of battle, but of rainstorms, of hunger, of the way silence can both comfort and punish. He spoke of how the jungle had taught him to listen, to observe before acting, to find peace in repetition. Discipline, he would say, is not about control. It is about harmony, with yourself, and with the world that does not care if you survive. He smiled often in those days, a small, weathered smile that carried the calm of a man who had made peace with all his ghosts. He once told the reporter, "I used to believe the greatest thing a man could do was die for a cause. Now I think the greatest thing is to live for one." His students called him sensei, teacher. And in a way, that word fit better than soldier ever had. He spoke little of glory. He preferred stories of resilience, the way a sapling bends in the wind but does not break, the way a wounded bird still sings in the rain. And when visitors came, curious about the man who had survived 30 years of war alone, they often left in silence, unsure if they had met a hero, a relic, or something gentler, a survivor who had outlived even the meaning of survival. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he still wrote in his old field notebook. The handwriting was neat and precise, just as it had been in 1944. But the words were softer now, reflections, meditations, small fragments of wisdom. One entry read, "The forest forgave me long before I forgave myself. It knew I was only a man trying to follow orders in a world that no longer existed." And another, "To endure is to change slowly. The trees taught me that. The longer they stand, the deeper their roots reach into the dark." He aged with that same patience. When asked if he ever felt bitterness for the years he lost, he shook his head. "Lost?" he said. "No. The jungle gave me back everything I thought I'd lost: time to think, to feel, to understand. I only needed 30 years to realize it." And then, as he often did, he would laugh softly, a sound rare and weightless, like wind through bamboo. In his final years, Hiroo Onoda began to drift toward silence again, not the fearful quiet of the jungle, but a tranquil kind, as if he were walking slowly back through the pages of his own life. He was no longer the man who once polished his rifle beneath a leaking palm roof. He was older now, softer, though the steel of discipline still lingered in his posture. He rose early each morning, brewed his tea, and tended to a small garden outside his home. There, beneath the morning mist, he found a new sort of ritual, one that needed no orders, no watchtower, no command. Visitors still came sometimes, journalists, historians, young soldiers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who refused to surrender for nearly 3 decades. They expected bitterness or pride, but what they found instead was stillness. When asked if he regretted those 30 years, he smiled faintly and said, "Regret is only for those who stopped believing too soon. I may have been wrong, but I was faithful to my duty." Was no anger in him, only the gentle melancholy of someone who had outlived his own story. At night, he would sit by his window and look toward the horizon. The city lights shimmered there, restless and bright, a world of speed, of voices, of instant change. He sometimes whispered that it felt too loud, too fast. He missed the rhythm of the jungle, the patient breathing of nature, the long conversations with silence. He often dreamed of Lubang Island. In his dreams, the rain still fell in steady sheets. The trees still whispered like sentries. He would hear the distant echo of his comrades' laughter, fading into the wind. And always he would wake before dawn, his heart calm but heavy, as if the island still held a part of his soul. He once wrote in his notebook, "We all have a jungle we carry inside, a place where time stops, and the world no longer calls your name." It was during those years that he began to write more seriously, reflections on endurance, discipline, and solitude. He wrote of the quiet dignity of survival, the thin line between faith and delusion, and the strange beauty of being the last man still fighting for a forgotten world. He did not seek fame or forgiveness. He simply wanted to understand what it had all meant. His health began to fade, gently, like the slow dimming of a lantern. Yet his mind remained sharp, disciplined even in decline. Each day, he walked a little slower through the park near his home. Sometimes the sound of wind through the trees would make him pause, as though some familiar melody were calling him back. He stopped once beside a pond and saw his reflection ripple in the water. An old man stared back, a man who had once lived by a code that outlasted empires. He watched that reflection for a long time before murmuring, "It was never about the war. It was about the promise." And perhaps that was true. Perhaps the world's laughter, the news stories, the documentaries, they had all missed that simple truth. He had not stayed in the jungle out of madness or pride. He had stayed because, to him, duty was sacred, something a man upheld even when no one was watching. He once told a student, "The hardest part of coming home is realizing the world has forgotten the language of honor." As his steps grew shorter and his hair turned silver, Onoda became something like a relic of another age, not worshipped, not pitied, but quietly respected. He was a man who had fought too long, and lived long enough to make peace with that. On the last day of the year, he took one final walk through his garden. The wind moved gently through the leaves, and the scent of earth filled the air. He stopped, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I am home." In the final chapter of his story, Hiroo Onoda's life would close not with gunfire or ceremony, but with the same silence that had once guarded him in the jungle, a stillness that carried both the weight of history and the peace of forgiveness. He became, in the eyes of the world, a symbol, the last soldier of a war long over, a man who had walked 30 years in the shadow of an empire that no longer existed. Newspapers called him a hero. Documentaries told his story. Children repeated his name like a legend. But he cared little for headlines. He cared only for the quiet. The whisper of wind in trees, the scent of earth after rain, the way sunlight struck a leaf in the morning, these were the things that reminded him of life, not duty. He spent his final years teaching, writing, walking slowly through forests and parks, always observing, always remembering. Sometimes, when the wind shifted just so, he could hear Lubang Island calling, a memory so vivid that he almost felt the soft mud underfoot, the weight of his rifle on his shoulder, the distant laughter of his comrades. And yet, he had learned to live in both worlds. The jungle remained inside him, but so did peace. He had survived battles no one could imagine, endured years that had been erased from history, and emerged not bitter, not broken, but deeply aware of life's quiet fragility. Onoda often reflected on the irony of his existence. A man who fought a war without knowing it had ended, now teaching the world about patience, resilience, and the strength of the human spirit. He understood, better than anyone, that time is both cruel and merciful. It can trap a man in the past, yet it can also set him free. He once said, "The war that never ended taught me more about life than any peace could. I survived not because of orders, but because I learned how to endure not just the world, but myself." And in that endurance, he found his true victory. Not over enemies, not over nations, but over the passage of time itself. When he finally passed away, it was quietly, peacefully, surrounded by the trees he loved, the earth he respected, and the students he had guided. No guns fired. No flags flew. There was only the slow, gentle rhythm of life continuing, the wind through leaves, the hum of insects, the distant chatter of birds. Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who time had forgotten, became a whisper in history, a living lesson that courage is not always shown in battle, that duty does not always end in victory, and that the human spirit can endure far longer than the wars we wage. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. The jungle, the world, and the quiet mind of a soldier who waited 30 years finally rested together, in harmony.